Chapter 2. 3 more months dragged by. Their little horde of flame orchids reached 15, then 18. They realized, of course, that the gem wouldn't command the fabulous price of that first one, but half that price, even a tenth of it, meant wealth, meant leisure and luxury. It was worth the year of sacrifice. Titan swung endlessly about its primary. 9-hour days succeeded 9-hour nights of unbelievable ferocity. The eternal wind howled and bit and tore, and the shifting ice mountains heaved and roared under Saturn's tidal drag. Sometimes, during the day, the pair ventured into the open, but the boisterous winds clung precariously to frigid slopes. Once Diane was swept bodily away, saving herself miraculously on the verge of one of the deep and mysterious crevasses that bounded their mountain slope, and thereafter they were very cautious. Once they dared to penetrate the grove of rubbery and elastic whiplash trees that grew in the shelter of the nearest cliff. The things lashed out at them with resounding strokes, not violent enough to fell them, but stinging sharply even through the inch-thick layer of sponge rubber that insulated their bodies from the cold. And every 7.5 days the wind died to a strange and oddly silent calm, was still for half an hour or so, and then roared with renewed ferocity from the opposite direction. Thus it marked Titan's revolution. At almost equal intervals, every 8 days, the native appeared with the clock. The creature seemed unable to master the intricate problem of winding it, and always presented it mournfully, brightening at once as Diane set it ticking again. There was one impending event that worried Tim at times. Twice in its 30-year period, Saturn eclipses the sun. And for 4 Titanian days, 72 hours, Titan is in utter darkness. The giant planet was nearing that point now, and would reach it long before the rocket ship, speeding from the Earth at perigee, was due. Human occupation dated back only 6 years. No one knew what 4 days of darkness might do to the little world of Titan. The absolute zero of space? Probably not, because of the dense and xenon-rich atmosphere, but what storms, what titanic upheavals of ice might accompany the night of eclipse? Glowing Saturn itself supplied a little heat, of course, about 1/3 as much as the distant sun. Well, worry was futile. Tim glanced at Diane, mending a rip in the furry face mask of her outdoor garment, and suggested a stroll. A stroll in the sunlight. He phrased it sardonically. It was August, back on Earth. Diane agreed. She always agreed, cheerfully and readily. Without her, this project would have been utterly unbearable, and he wondered amazedly how Simmons had stood it, how those others, scattered around Titan's single little continent, were standing it. He sighed, slipped into his thick garment, and opened the door into the roaring hell outside. That was the time they came near disaster. They crawled, crept, and struggled their way into the lee of an ice hummock, and stood there panting and gasping for a moment's rest. Tim raised his head to peer over the crest, and saw through his visor's protecting goggles something unique in his experience on Titan. He frowned at it through the dense refractive air of the planet. It was hard to judge distances when the atmosphere made everything quiver like heat waves. "Look, Di!" he exclaimed. "A bird!" It did look like one, sailing on the wind toward them, wings outspread. It grew larger. It was as large as a pterodactyl, bearing down on them with the force of that 100-mile wind behind it. Tim could make out a fierce 3-foot beak. Diane screamed. The thing was headed for them. It was diving now at airplane speed. It was the girl who seized and flung a jagged piece of ice. The thing veered higher, swept like a cloud above them, and was gone. It could not fly upwind. They looked it up in Young's book at the shack. That intrepid explorer had seen and named the creature. It was a knife-kite, the same sort of beast that had accounted for the death of one of his men. It wasn't a bird. It didn't really fly. It just sailed like a kite before the terrific blasts of Titan, and touched ground only during the weekly calm, or when it had succeeded in stabbing some prey. But life was scarce indeed on the icy little world, except for the occasional natives who came and went mysteriously as spirits, and that single knife-kite, and the whiplash trees near the cliff. They saw nothing living. Of course, the crystal bubbles of the ice ants marked the glacial surface of the hills, but these creatures never emerged, laboring incessantly beneath their little domes that grew like mushrooms as they melted within and received fresh deposits of ice crystals without. A lonely world, a wild, bizarre, forbidding, and unearthly little planet. It never actually snowed on Titan. The chill air could absorb too little water vapor for condensation as snow, but there was a substitute. During the days when the temperature often passed the melting point, shallow pools formed on the frozen oceans, augmented sometimes by mighty eruptions of frigid brine from below. The ferocious winds swept these pools into a spindrift that froze and went rushing as clouds of icy needles around the planet. Often during the darkness, Diane had watched from the window as one of these clouds loomed glittering in the cold green Saturn light, sweeping by with a scream and a slithering of ice crystals on the walls, and seeming to her mind like a tall, sheeted ghost. At such times, despite the atom-generated warmth of the tiny dwelling, she was apt to shiver and to draw her garment closer about her, though she was careful that Tim never observed it. So time passed in the trading shack, slowly and dismally. The weather, of course, was uniformly, unvaryingly terrible. Such weather as only Titan, near 900 million miles from the moderating sun, can present. The little world, with its orbital period of 15 days and 23 hours, had no perceptible seasons. Only the recurrent shifting of the winds from east to west marks its swing about gigantic Saturn. The season is always winter, fierce, bitter, unimaginable winter, to which the earthly storms of desolate Antarctica are as April on the Riviera. And, little by little, Saturn edged closer to the sun, until one day the western streak of its rings knifed a dark gash across the reddish disk. The eclipse was at hand. That night saw the catastrophe. Tim was dozing on the bunk. Diane was dreaming idly of green fields and warm sunlight. Outside roared a gale more than usually vociferous, and a steady parade of ice ghosts streamed past the windows. Low and ominous came the roar of shifting glacial mountains. Saturn and the sun, now nearly in a direct line, heaved at the planet with a redoubled tidal pull. And then suddenly came the clang of warning. A bell rang ominously. Diane knew what it meant. Months before, Tim had driven a row of posts into the ice, extending toward the cliff that sheltered the Whiplash Grove. He had foreseen the danger. He had rigged up an alarm. The bell meant that the cliff had shifted, had rolled upon the first of the stakes. Danger! Tim was springing frantically from the bunk. "Dress for outside!" he snapped. "Quickly!" He seized her lunacy sponge rubber parka and tossed it to her. He dragged on his own, cranked the door open to the pandemonium without, and a fierce and bitter blast swept in, upsetting a chair, spinning loose articles around the room. "Close the emergency pack!" he yelled above the tumult. "I'll take a look." Diane suppressed her upsurging fear as he vanished. She strapped the pack tightly, then poured the precious 18 flame orchids into a little leather pouch and suspended this about her throat. She forced calmness upon herself. Perhaps the ice cliff had stopped, or perhaps only the wind itself had snapped the warning post. She righted the chair and sat with her visor open despite the knife-sharp blasts from the door. Tim was coming, she saw his gloved hand as he seized the doorframe, then his fur-masked face, eyes grim behind the non-frosting goggles. "Outside!" he yelled, seizing the pack. She rose and scrambled after him into the howling inferno just as the second bell clanged. Barely in time! As the tornado sent her sprawling and clutching, she had a sharply etched glimpse of a mighty pinnacle of glittering ice looming high above the shack. There was a rumble, a roar deeper than the winds, and the shack was gone. One iron wall, caught by the gale, swept like a giant bat above her, and she heard it go clanging and clattering along the slope to the east. Dazed and horribly frightened, she clawed her way after Tim into the shelter of a ridge, watching him while he wrestled the pack that struggled in the blast like something living. She was calm when at last he got it strapped to his shoulders. "This is the end, isn't it, Tim?" she said, putting her visor close against his helmet. "Because I'm glad I came with you then. I'm glad it's both of us together." Tim groaned despairingly, and the blast tore the sound away. He turned suddenly, slipping his arm around her figure. "I'm sorry, Di," he said huskily. He wanted to kiss her, an impossibility, of course, in a Titanian night. It would have been a kiss of death. They would have died with lips frozen together. He put away the thought that maybe that might be the pleasanter way, since death was inevitable now, anyway. Better, he decided, to die fighting. He pulled her down into the lee of the ridge and sat thinking. They couldn't stay here, that was obvious. The rocket wasn't due for 3 months, and long before then they'd be frozen corpses, rolling away before the hurricane or buried in some crevasse. They couldn't build a habitable shelter without tools, and if they could, their atomic stove was somewhere under the shifting cliff. They couldn't attempt the journey to Nivea, 100 miles away across the mountains of the damned. Or could they? That was the only possible alternative. "Di," Tim said tensely, "we're going to Nivea. Don't be startled. Listen, the wind's just shifted. It's behind us. We have almost 8 Earth days before it changes. If we can make it 12, 13 miles a day, if we can make it, we'll be safe. If we don't make it before the wind shifts—" He paused. "Well, it's no worse than dying here." Diane was silent. Tim frowned thoughtfully behind his goggles. It was a possibility. Pack, parka, and all, he weighed less than Earth weight, not as much less as one would think, of course. Titan, although no larger than Mercury, is a dense little world, and besides, weight depends not only on a planet's density, but also on distance from its center. But the wind might not hinder them so much, since they were traveling with it, not against it. Its terrible thrust, fiercer than even an equal earth wind, because the air contained 30% of the heavy gas xenon, would be dangerous enough, but... Anyway, they had no choice. "Come on, Di," Tim said, rising. They had to keep moving now. They could rest later, after sunrise, when the danger of a frozen sleep was less. Another terrible thought struck Tim. There would be only 3 more sunrises. Then, for 4 Titanian days, the little satellite would be in the mighty shadow of Saturn, and during that long eclipse, heaven alone knew what terrific forces might attack the harassed pair crawling painfully toward Nivea, the city of snow. But that had to be faced too. There was no alternative. Tim lifted Diane to her feet, and they crept cautiously out of the shelter of the ridge, bowing as the cruel wind caught them and bruised them, even through their thick suits, by flying ice fragments. It was a dark night for Titan. Saturn was on the other side of the little world. Along with the sun, it was soon to eclipse. But the stars shone brilliant and twinkling through the shallow but very dense and refractive atmosphere. The earth, which had so often lent a green spark of cheer to the lonely couple, was not among them. From the position of Titan, it was always near the sun, and showed only just before sunrise or just after sunset. Its absence now seemed a desolate omen. They came to a long, smooth, wind-swept slope. They made the error of trying to cross it erect, trusting to their cleated shoes for secure footing. It was misjudgment. The wind thrust them suddenly into a run, pressed them faster and faster until it was impossible to stop, and they were staggering through the darkness toward unknown terrain ahead. Tim flung himself recklessly against Diane. They fell in a heap and went sliding and rolling to crash at last against a low wall of ice 100 feet beyond. They struggled up, and Diane moaned inaudibly from the pain of a bruised knee. They crept cautiously on. They ended a bottomless crevasse from the depths of which came strange roarings and shriekings. They slipped miserably past a glittering cliff that shook and shifted above them, and when at last the vast hulk of Saturn rose over the wild land before them, and the tiny reddish sun followed like a ruby hung on a pendant, they were near exhaustion. Tim supported Diane to a crevice facing the sun. For many minutes they were silent, content to rest, and then he took a bar of chocolate from the pack, and they ate, slipping the squares hastily through visors opened for each bite. But under the combined radiance of Saturn and the sun, the temperature rose rapidly, more than 100 degrees. When Tim glanced at his wrist thermometer, it was already near 38, and pools of water were forming in the wind-sheltered spots. He scooped some up with the rubber cup, and they drank. Water, at least, was no problem. Food might be, however, if they lived long enough to consume that in the pack. Humans couldn't eat Titanian life because of its arsenical metabolism. They had to exist on food laboriously transported from the Earth, or, as did the Nivian settlers, on Titanian creatures from whose substance the arsenic had first been chemically removed. The Nivians ate the ice ants and whiplash trees, and occasionally, it was sometimes whispered, the Titanian natives. Diane had fallen asleep, lying huddled in a pool of icy water that flowed off into the open, and then was whirled into sparkling spray by the wind. He shook her gently. They couldn't afford to lose time now, not with the shadow of the eclipse looming ominously so few hours away. But it tore his heart to see her eyes crinkle in a wary smile as she rose. He damned himself again for ever bringing her to this. So they plodded on, haltered and trampled by the fierce and ruthless gale. He had no idea how far they had traveled during the night. From the crest of a high ridge he looked back, but the shifting hills of ice made localities hard to recognize, and he could not be sure that the grim escarpment far behind was actually the cliff that had crushed their shack. He let Diane rest again from noon until sunset, nearly 5 hours. She regained much of the strength spent in the struggle of the night, but when the dropping sun set his wrist thermometer tumbling far toward the 100 below zero mark, it seemed to her as if she had not rested at all. Yet they survived another night of inferno, and the gray of dawn found them still staggering and stumbling before the incredible ferocity of that eternal wind. During the morning a native appeared. They recognized him. In his clawed hands was the battered case of the 8-day clock. He sidled up to them, head toward the wind, and held out his short arms to display the mechanism. He whined plaintively, and obviously thought himself cheated. Tim felt an unreasoning hope at the sight of him, but it vanished immediately. The creature simply couldn't understand their predicament. Titan was the only world he knew, and he couldn't conceive of beings not adapted to its fierce environment. So the man stood silently as Diane wound the clock and responded dully to her smile as she returned it. "This time, old fellow," she said to the native, "it's ticking away our lives. If we're not in Nivea by the time it stops again." She patted the blunt head. The creature cooed and sidled away.